Welcome back, everyone. This is Mr. Nightveil. Today we're covering 7 of the most disturbing true maritime stories ever submitted to this channel. Deckhands, engineers, and crew members sent these in, and these aren't campfire inventions. Too specific, too consistent, too unsettling to dismiss. We cross-checked the details, and they line up with ship logs and maritime incident reports. Please subscribe, turn the bell on, because this channel is about slow-burning authentic horror over cheap jump scares. And share your own story in the comments. Your story may be the next one we uncover. Now kill the cabin light. Let's begin. My name's Danny Ruiz, and I was 26 days into my first contract as an ordinary seaman aboard the Pacific Meridian, a container ship the size of 4 football fields, running the Trans-Pacific route between Long Beach and Busan, when I first saw the name that wasn't supposed to be there. The watch rotation gets posted every Sunday outside the mess deck, taped to a corkboard that's gone soft and warped from 20 years of salt air. 4 names to a column, 12-hour split shifts, standard stuff. My name was there. D. Ruiz, second watch, 0000 to 0400, right under a name I didn't recognize. E. Cardoza. I figured he was new, somebody I hadn't crossed paths with yet, on a ship this big, where you can go 3 days without seeing half the crew that isn't on your watch. I asked the AB on duty, a quiet guy named Petrov who mostly kept to himself, who Cardoza was. He looked at the board for a second longer than he needed to, then told me not to worry about it, that it wasn't my business, and walked off toward the bridge. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say about a coworker's name. I let it go for about 4 days. Then I had a reason to be in the ship's office, dropping off a form for the chief mate, and I asked to see the crew manifest. Told him I wanted to know who else was aboard since I was still learning faces. He pulled it up on the terminal without thinking twice. 41 names. I read it twice. There was no Cardoza on it. Not in the deck department, not in engineering, not in the galley. I didn't say anything. I just said thanks and left, because something in the way the chief mate hadn't even blinked at the request told me this wasn't the first time somebody had gone looking. 2 nights later, I made a decision that I still don't fully understand the logic of, except that I was 26 and curious, and it was 3 in the morning, and the ocean does something to your judgment when there's nothing but black water in every direction. Cardoza was slotted for the 0400 to 0800 watch, the one nobody wanted, the graveyard stretch where you're mostly just staring at radar returns and drinking bad coffee. I decided I'd cover it, show up, do the walk, log the checks under his name, just to see what would happen. What happened is that when I got to the watch station and opened the logbook to make my first entry, there were already entries in it, for that watch, written the day before, in a hand that wasn't mine and wasn't anyone else's I recognized from the other logs I'd flipped through. Barometric readings, a note about a running light on the port side flickering, the kind of granular detail you only write down if you were actually there watching it happen. I stood there in the wheelhouse with my own pen in my hand, useless, because the job was already done. I told Torres about it the next evening. Torres was the senior able seaman on our watch, 40 years at sea. The kind of guy who'd trained half the mates currently running ships up and down the Pacific. I expected him to tell me I was tired, seeing things, that somebody was playing a joke. Instead, he just nodded, slow, like I'd told him the weather was turning. He said every ship this old carries one, and that the best thing I could do was cover the shift when it came up, log what needed logging, and not ask questions that nobody on board could actually answer for me. He said it the way you'd explain a company policy about overtime forms. Completely flat, completely normal. That was worse than if he'd looked scared. I couldn't leave it alone after that. A few nights later, I had some downtime and went digging through the archive of old logbooks kept in a cabinet below the chart table. Water-stained binders going back over a decade, because the Pacific Meridian was an old hull, refitted twice, and nobody had ever bothered digitizing the early records. I found Cardoza, not on a watch rotation, in an incident report from 15 years earlier. Esteban Cardoza, deckhand, 29 years old, killed during a mooring operation in Busan, when a parted line whipped back across the deck. The report was 3 paragraphs long and ended with a line about the investigation being referred to the company's insurers. I mentioned what I'd found to the second mate, carefully, framing it as idle curiosity about ship history. She got cagey fast and told me the company never fully closed out the claim because of a dispute over whether proper safety protocol had been followed at the mooring station that night, and that as long as the claim stayed open, certain positions on the crewing software couldn't be deleted without triggering a compliance flag that could bring an underwriting audit down on the company. She said it fast and quiet, like she was reciting something she'd been told once and had decided not to think about since. 3 nights after that, I was down near the aft mooring station doing a routine check when my flashlight caught something wedged behind a fairlead, half rusted into the deck grating. A photograph, laminated, the kind guys used to carry in their wallets before phones. A young man with his arm around a woman on a beach somewhere, both of them laughing at whoever was holding the camera. I didn't need anyone to tell me who it was. Up until that point, Cardoza had been an abstraction, a glitch, a name on a corkboard. Looking at that photograph, soaked through and curling at the edges after 15 years of ocean weather working at it through gaps in the deck fittings, he became a man who'd had a life, and a person waiting for him somewhere who probably never got a straight answer about what happened. 4 days after I found the photograph, we hit weather coming up on the Japanese coast, hard swells, and I was on the aft deck securing a container lashing that had worked loose, right by that same mooring station, when a line under tension snapped its restraint and came across the deck close enough that I felt the wind off it before I registered what had happened. Nobody got hurt, but I sat down hard on the deck afterward and didn't move for a solid minute, because for that half a second, I understood exactly how fast 15 years earlier had happened to somebody else in almost the same spot. I went to the captain that night, not to report anything, just because I needed to say it out loud to somebody with the authority to actually know things. He didn't act surprised. He poured 2 cups of coffee and told me he'd been third mate on this same ship the night Cardoza died, that he'd been the one who found him, and that in the years since he'd made it his own quiet business to see that the watch got covered every voyage, that the log got written, that the position never sat empty long enough to draw attention from people in an office who'd never smelled salt water in their lives and who'd happily let a dead man's family keep waiting on a settlement forever if it meant the claim file stayed simple. He wasn't hiding a ghost. He was hiding a company's negligence, one voyage at a time, the only way he knew how, because reporting it properly might have meant his job, the ship's insurance status, and possibly the jobs of everyone standing on that deck. He told me something else that night that sat heavier than anything before it. He said every deckhand who ever covered that watch ended up doing what Torres had done for me, quietly showing the next new hire the ropes when their turn came, passing the thing along like a piece of gear nobody wanted to be responsible for but that had to go to somebody. He said I had a choice now, that I knew the whole shape of it. I could make noise, write letters, try to force the company's hand, or I could finish my contract, keep my head down, and let it keep moving the way it had been moving for 15 years. I thought about that photograph behind the fairlead for a long time before I decided anything. In the end, I didn't write any letters. I told myself it wasn't my fight to win from the bottom of a crew roster, that a 26-year-old ordinary seaman, 6 months into his first contract, wasn't going to be the one who cracked open a shipping company's insurance fraud, and that the honest truth was I needed the job more than I needed to be right. I finished the crossing. I did my watches. I did Cardoza's when they came up, and I never told anyone besides my own conscience what that decision cost me. We made Long Beach on a Tuesday morning, with the fog still sitting low over the water, and I went up to the mess deck one last time before signing off to see the new rotation posted for the crew, flying in to relieve us. I wasn't expecting to look for anything in particular, but my eyes went straight to it anyway, the way they do when you already half know what you're going to find. My own name was on that board, twice, once under the outgoing notes, closing out my contract like it should, and once again, further down, slotted into the new rotation for the incoming crew, second watch, 0000 to 0400, right where Cardoza's name used to sit. I stood there a long time reading it. I never found out if it was a clerical error, Some tired scheduler made typing up 2 different rosters off the same template. Or something else. Something I didn't have the stomach to walk down to the office and ask about. I got my bag, went down the gangway, and didn't look back at the ship. But I think about that corkboard more than I'd like to admit. And about some kid I'll never meet, boarding in a few days for his first contract, running his finger down a list of names he doesn't recognize yet, stopping on mine. The first thing I noticed was the powdered eggs. We go through maybe 2 tins a week on a boat this size. 6 men, 3 meals a day. And I keep count because that's my job. That's the whole job. Keeping the numbers straight so we don't run short 40 miles past anywhere that sells breakfast. 3 weeks into a run that should have taken 2, weather pinning us out past the shelf longer than anyone wanted, I opened the dry stores and we were down to 1 tin. I stood there doing the math in my head, the kind of math you do without meaning to, and it didn't work. 6 men eating 3 meals don't burn through supplies like 10 men eating 5. I told myself it was spoilage. Damp gets into everything out here. Salt air eats through packaging you'd swear was sealed tight. And I'd seen a whole case of crackers turn to paste on a run, 2 years back from a hairline crack in the container. So I did what you do. I went through every box, every tin, every sack of flour, checking seals, checking for damp, checking for the kind of rot that would explain missing weight. Found nothing. Everything that was gone clean. Not spoiled, not wasted, just eaten. That should have been the end of it. A shrug and a tighter lock on the pantry door. But then I started paying attention to what exactly was missing. And it wasn't random. It was the easy food. Canned meat you don't need to cook. Bread. Things a man could take back to his bunk and eat in the dark without anyone hearing a stove. So I started marking cans. Small thing. A grease pencil dot on the lids. Counted them before I turned in. Counted them again in the morning. 3 nights running. Nothing moved. The 4th night, at maybe 2 in the morning, with the boat pitching hard enough that I was half awake anyway, I heard the galley door. I lay there telling myself it was Danny going for a piss and taking the long way round. But Danny's watch didn't have him up. And the sound wasn't the head door, it was the pantry latch. That particular stiff click it makes. I got up quiet and looked, expecting one of the deckhands. Maybe young Petar who eats like he's still growing. It was the captain, standing in the galley in his oilskins at 2 in the morning, filling a canvas sack with canned meat and a loaf I'd baked that afternoon, moving like a man who'd done this before and knew exactly which boards didn't creak. I didn't say anything. I've worked for captains who'd have my head for less than watching them from a doorway, so I let him go, and then I followed him, staying back the way you learn to on a boat, where every space is either wide open or a coffin, no real cover. Just angles and darkness, and the engine noise to hide your footsteps. He didn't go toward his cabin. He went aft, past the ice hold, to the old dry storage compartment we hadn't used since we loaded out. The one with the bent hasp that never got fixed, because nobody needed it fixed. Except now it had a padlock on it. A good one, brass, not standard boat issue, not something that comes out of the ship's chandlery. He knocked twice, low, like a code. And from inside, muffled through steel, something knocked back. My first thought, and I'm not proud of it, was that we had a stowaway. Some poor bastard who'd slipped aboard back in port looking for passage or running from something, and the captain was keeping him hidden and fed rather than deal with the paperwork of a body found or a man handed over to the Coast Guard 40 miles from anywhere. That thought was almost comforting, because the alternative hadn't occurred to me yet. I went back to my bunk and didn't sleep. In the morning I did the head count out of pure habit, the way you touch a bruise to see if it still hurts. And it came out right. 6 men. It had always come out right. Every single morning of this run. Whatever was behind that door, the boat's paperwork said we'd never had a 7th. I let 2 days pass before I said anything, watching the captain, watching the crew, trying to work out who knew what. Petar didn't know anything. That much was obvious. He was too easy, too unbothered, laughing at the wrong times the way a man does when he's genuinely got nothing weighing on him. But Ochoa, our engineer, wouldn't meet my eye anymore, and Danny had started taking his meals up on deck, even in weather that made no sense to eat outside in. I cornered the captain in the wheelhouse on the third day and asked him straight what was in the aft hold. He told me it was tackle, spare gear, and to mind the stores and let him mind the boat. It was the kind of lie a man tells when he's already decided you're not worth the effort of a good one, and that told me more than a good lie would have. So that night, I went back with the spare set of keys I keep for the whole boat, the ones the owners insist the cook carries in case of fire, and I let myself into that hold. The smell hit me before my eyes adjusted. Sweat and waste, and something like fear has a smell. If you've ever been around it, you know what I mean. There was a man in the corner, sitting against a coil of old net, one wrist run through a loop of chain bolted to a support strut, not cruel iron shackles, just enough to keep him from wandering, from doing something to himself or someone else. He looked up at me and I recognized him, and that recognition turned my stomach worse than anything else had, because I knew for a fact this man had signed off the crew list before we ever left port. I remembered him standing on the dock with his duffel, remembered shaking his hand, wishing him luck on whatever came next for him. Dale? Our old winch operator, the man who'd trained Petar on the gear not 4 months back. He didn't say much, just looked at me with eyes that weren't tracking right, and asked if it was time for the medicine yet, which was its own kind of answer, because we don't carry medicine on this boat beyond a first aid kit and seasickness pills. I went straight to the captain, didn't even wait for daylight, and told him I knew, and that I wanted the truth, or I'd raise it on the radio myself. What he told me changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about the last 3 weeks. Dale hadn't had his episode out here. He'd had it 2 days before we left port, in the crew house, and it had been bad. Bad enough that he'd put Ochoa's cousin through a window and near drowned another man in a rain barrel before 3 of them got him down. The captain hadn't reported it, because a psychiatric incident on the books meant an investigation, meant the boat sitting in port through the only decent weather window of the season, meant an insurance flag that could sink a man who was already 2 payments behind on the boat itself. So he'd told the office Dale had gone home sick, filed the crew change, and instead brought him aboard in secret the night before departure, chained him below where the noise of the engine would cover whatever he might do, and told himself he'd sort it out once they made port again, once there was time, once there was money. I asked how long he thought he could keep a grown man chained in a hold, and he didn't have an answer for that. Just the kind of silence that told me he hadn't been thinking that far ahead at all. He'd just been surviving one day into the next, same as the rest of us out here, except his one day into the next had a human being suffering at the bottom of it. I asked who else knew, and he named them: Ochoa, Danny. Both of them roped in almost by accident. Ochoa, because he'd heard something through the hull the first week and gone to check. Danny, because he'd caught the captain the way I had, only earlier, and let himself be talked into silence with a promise of extra pay at the end of the run. That was the worst part for me. Worse than the chain, worse than the smell. I was the last one to know. 5 men on a boat of 6, keeping a secret from the man whose entire job was counting what was there and what wasn't, and somehow none of it had ever shown up on my numbers, except in tins of powdered egg. We were 3 days from the nearest port with any real facilities, when the weather turned properly bad. The kind of North Atlantic weather that makes you understand why boats like ours go missing, and nobody ever finds more than a life ring. The boat was taking rolls that put green water over the rail, and somewhere in the worst of it, the strut Dale was chained to tore loose from the deck plating. Whether from the stress of the sea, or from him fighting it in a panic none of us will ever know for certain. He got out into the passage in the dark with the whole boat heaving, and for about 20 minutes it was the kind of chaos that doesn't leave you afterward. A grown man out of his mind with fear and whatever was wrong in his head, loose on a boat in a storm, and 5 of us trying to get hands on him without anyone going over the side or through a bulkhead. Petar finally understood then what had been happening. I watched it hit him in real time, watched a young man's face change as he helped hold down someone he'd once called a friend. We got him secured, this time with blankets and 2 men taking shifts rather than a chain, and the captain finally did the one thing he should have done from the start. He got on the radio. Not to the Coast Guard, not yet, but to another trawler working the same grounds, an older captain he trusted, and asked, careful with his words, what a man does when someone aboard needs help that can't wait for port. That conversation is the reason Dale is alive today, and not a name read out at a memorial service. The other captain talked ours through keeping him calm, keeping him hydrated, keeping him from hurting himself in the last 2 days of the run, and quietly, without ever saying it outright over an open channel, made clear that whatever had happened out here needed to stay between the boats until we reached land, because a young man in that state hauled in by Coast Guard cutter with cameras on the dock was a different kind of ending than one carried off quietly by his own family. We made port a full day early, radioed ahead with engine trouble as the excuse, and Dale's brother was waiting on the dock when we tied up, having driven through the night after a call none of us but the captain heard. I helped walk him off the boat myself, an arm under his shoulder, and he thanked me for the bread, which was somehow the thing that broke me more than anything else that whole run. Before I left the boat that day, the captain caught me on the gangway and said what I already knew he'd say, that none of it went in the log, not the hold, not the chain, not any of it, that as far as any paperwork was concerned, Dale had gone home sick before we ever left port, and nothing after that had happened. He wasn't threatening me. He looked more tired than threatening, a man who'd made a choice under pressure that he was going to have to live with regardless of what I did next. I never logged it. I think about that some nights, what it means that a boat can carry a secret like that for 3 weeks in open water, 5 men keeping a 6th chained below decks, and the only reason any of it surfaced was a cook counting tins of powdered egg. There's no dock inspector checking a man's mind before he signs onto a crew list, no form that catches what happens 200 miles from the nearest witness. Out there, it turns out, the only thing standing between a sick man and disaster is whether somebody happens to notice the food running out faster than it should. My name doesn't matter for this. What matters is the ship, and the 11 hours I spent alone on her, and the fact that I still can't explain what happened. Not to my wife, not to my supervisor, not to myself lying awake at 3 in the morning when the house is too quiet. I'd been doing decommissioning work for 6 years by then. Cruise liners mostly, sometimes a container ship, once a Navy support vessel that still had ammunition crates welded shut in the hold that nobody wanted to talk about. The job is simple on paper. The vessel is scheduled for scrapping or long-term layup, and before she gets towed out, somebody has to walk her from bow to stern and confirm every system that's supposed to be dead is actually dead. Power, water, fire suppression, ballast. You sign a sheet, you go home. That's the whole job. The Meridian Star had been sitting in dry dock for 11 days when I got the call. She was a mid-sized cruise liner, built in the late 90s, decommissioned after the parent company folded, and nobody wanted to absorb the maintenance costs on a ship that old. She'd done her last real voyage 2 years earlier, then sat in a holding berth until the scrap contract finally went through. My job was one night: walk her, confirm shutdown, sign off before the tow crew arrived at 6 the next morning to take her to the breakers. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I am not a superstitious person. I don't believe ships have souls. I don't believe in the stories other engineers tell about hearing footsteps on empty decks. I've always figured those stories come from tired men working night shifts alone, hearing their own blood in their ears and mistaking it for company. I say this because I need you to understand that what happened to me that night didn't come from a place of already being afraid. I walked up that gangway feeling nothing but mild irritation that I'd drawn the overnight slot. The first thing that struck me, and this is turning point 1, was the silence itself, but not in the way people mean when they say a place is silent. A ship in dry dock still makes sound. Metal contracts as the temperature drops. Water in the harbor slaps against the hull blocks. Somewhere a loose cable ticks against a bulkhead in the wind. What struck me was that the Meridian Star had none of that. She sat in her cradle like something holding its breath, and I remember standing on the gangway for a full minute just listening, trying to place what was missing, before I realized it was everything. No creak, no tick, no hum from anywhere in her 1,000-foot length. A ship that size should never be that quiet, dead or alive. I clocked in at 9:15 and started my walk from the bridge, which is standard procedure, working top to bottom so gravity does some of the checking for you on the water systems. The bridge was already stripped, Most of the navigation equipment pulled for salvage weeks earlier. Just empty mounting brackets and a helm that some previous crew had left, turned hard to port, like the ship was still trying to correct a course nobody was steering. I noted the main breaker panel was dark, confirmed shore power was isolated, and moved on to deck 7, where the passenger cabin started. That's when I saw the first light. Turning point 2. A single cabin door down the corridor, maybe 40 feet ahead of me, had a thin gold line under it. Not flickering, not dim, just on, the way a reading lamp looks on when someone's fallen asleep with a book. I stood there long enough to convince myself I was looking at a reflection off my own flashlight, some trick of the beam bouncing off brass fittings, so I turned my flashlight off. The line under the door stayed. I want to be honest about my first instinct, because it wasn't fear, it was annoyance. Somebody on the salvage crew had left a battery lamp running, or there was a fault in a circuit that was supposed to be dead, and either way it meant more paperwork. I walked down, opened the cabin door, and found nothing. No lamp, no fixture even plugged in. The room already stripped down to bare walls and a mattress leaning against the frame. The light was gone the second I opened the door, and I told myself it had simply switched off on its own timer, the way the automated systems sometimes did during their final power-down cycles. I logged it and kept moving, because that's what the job trains you to do. You log the anomaly, you don't stand around interrogating it. Turning point 3 came about 40 minutes later, on deck 5, when I heard the elevator. Not saw, heard. That specific mechanical sigh of a cable elevator engaging, followed by the low whine of it moving between floors. I stood absolutely still in the corridor and listened to it pass me, going down, the sound fading toward the lower decks. And I remember the hair on my arm standing up, not because it was frightening exactly, but because it was so mundane. It sounded like any elevator in any building, which was the wrong kind of ordinary for a ship with no power routed anywhere near the elevator banks. I'd confirmed that circuit dead myself, 20 minutes earlier, cross-checked against the isolation sheet. I went and found the elevator. The doors were open on deck 5, car sitting right there, dark, dead, dust already settling on the buttons. I checked the indicator lights. Nothing lit. I stood in the open door and looked down the shaft with my flashlight and saw only cable and shadow. This is turning point 4, and it's the one that actually put a knot in my stomach for the first time that night. I checked the shaft logs on my tablet, the maintenance history that gets uploaded automatically whenever a system cycles, even in isolation mode, even when it's supposed to be dead. There was a log entry, elevator 2, deck 5 to deck 2, timestamp 11 minutes before I'd heard it. The system had recorded its own movement. Something had called that elevator and ridden it down, and the ship, dead as she was, had dutifully written it down like she always did. I called my supervisor. It rang twice and went to voicemail, because it was 1 in the morning and he was asleep, because of course he was, because I was the only person awake on this entire stretch of dock. I left a message that I tried to keep professional and probably didn't manage, something about an electrical fault I wanted logged before the tow crew arrived. Then I did the thing I've regretted since, which is turning point 5. I decided to keep going instead of walking off the ship and calling it a night. 6 more decks to check, a job half done, and some stubborn part of me that didn't want to be the engineer who walked off a routine job because of a light and an elevator glitch. I've thought about that decision more than almost any other decision I've made in my life. Deck 4 was worse, and this is turning point 6. Not because anything happened, but because everything had already happened by the time I got there. Every cabin door on the port side stood open, all the way down the corridor, evenly spaced rectangles of dark, leading off into nothing. I know for a fact those doors had been closed when the salvage crew signed off 2 days earlier, because it was in their report, part of the standard fire safety walkthrough. 40 doors, standing open in a perfectly straight line, like something had walked the length of the corridor checking each room and hadn't bothered to close up after itself. I didn't go down that corridor. I noted it, photographed it from the stairwell entrance, and took the stairs instead of walking through. Turning point 7 happened on deck 3, in the crew galley, where I found the temperature had dropped hard enough that my breath was fogging, colder than any other space on the ship, colder than the exterior air that night by a wide enough margin that it shouldn't have been possible without active refrigeration, which was, again, confirmed dead on my sheet. I stood in that galley with my breath clouding in front of me, and I did the math in my head. The kind of math you do when you're trying to find an engineering explanation for something that doesn't want to give you one, and I couldn't make it work. Not with any system I'd isolated. Not with any physics I understood. I want to slow down here, because this next part, turning point 8, is the part I still turn over the most. I heard water running. Not dripping, not a leak, but running. The specific sound of a tap open at full pressure, coming from the crew showers just off the galley. The water main to that section had been shut and drained 8 days prior as part of the initial decommission sweep, verified, tagged, and locked. I walked to the shower room. The tap was on. Water was coming out of it, and it was warm. Warm the way water only gets when a boiler somewhere is actually heating it. I turned it off with my own hand. The metal was warm under my fingers. Turning point 9 is the moment I stopped pretending this was mechanical. Standing there with my hands still wet, I felt, for the first time since I'd stepped aboard, that I was being kept company. Not watched exactly. Nothing so specific as eyes on me, but accompanied. The way you can tell someone's walked into a room behind you before you've turned around. I didn't turn around. I finished drying my hand on my coveralls, and I made myself keep walking my route, because the alternative was admitting I was somewhere I couldn't finish the job, and some old stubborn engineer's pride wouldn't let me admit that yet. Deck 2 brought turning point 10, and this was the first time the ship gave me something that felt less like an anomaly and more like a message. The main dining hall, completely stripped, tables and chairs long since sold off or scrapped, just bare floor and the ghosts of bolt holes where fixtures used to sit. In the center of that empty floor, someone had arranged place settings, 4 of them, plates, though there were no plates left aboard according to inventory. Silverware laid out with a precision that felt deliberate, a folded napkin at each seat. I stood in the doorway of that room for a long time, and I did not go in. I called my supervisor again. This time he picked up, and this is turning point 11, because his voice on the other end of that call did something I wasn't expecting. He didn't laugh it off. He went quiet for a second too long, and then he said, "Careful," like he was choosing each word. "Just finish the checklist and get off the boat. Don't investigate anything. Just finish it and leave." I asked him what he meant by that, whether this had happened before. And he said something that I've never been able to get a straight answer about since, which is that the Meridian Star wasn't the first ship on this contract that engineers had reported anomalies on, and that the company had a policy of not discussing it because it wasn't good for the paperwork. Turning point 12 came right after I hung up, when I realized the 4 place settings had become 5. I hadn't looked away for more than the length of that phone call. I did not go count them twice to be sure. I photographed the room from the doorway and I moved on, because moving on was the only thing that felt like sanity anymore. Deck 1, the lowest passenger deck, gave me turning point 13, which was the theater. 200 seats, and every single one of them was folded down, occupied position, as if for a performance, though the stage itself sat completely bare and dark. I stood at the back of that theater, and I did not feel like the only person in the room. And I want to be honest that this is the point where I stopped narrating the night to myself as an engineer doing a job and started narrating it as someone trying to survive until sunrise. I still had the engine room to check, 4 decks down, and this is turning point 14. I almost didn't go. I stood at the top of the stairwell that led down into the ship's belly, and I thought seriously, for the first time that night, about simply walking off the ship, calling the job unfinished, and letting someone else deal with the consequences in the morning. What made me go down, in the end, wasn't courage. It was the thought that if I left the engine room unchecked, and something down there really was still live, some system that hadn't fully isolated, that failure could hurt someone on the tow crew at 6 that morning. That thought got me down 4 flights of stairs into the dark. The engine room was the one place on the entire ship that felt, briefly, normal. Cold metal, dead gauges, the ordinary stillness of heavy machinery that has actually stopped. I did my checks fast, hands shaking more than I wanted to admit, confirmed every reading matched the shutdown sheet, and turned to leave. Turning point 15 was the door. The engine room door, which I had propped open with a wedge before I came down, exactly the way I always do, was closed when I turned around. Not locked, I want to be clear, because I tried it and it opened, but closed, deliberately, the wedge kicked aside and sitting 3 feet from where I'd placed it. I didn't run. I want that on record, because in the retelling people always assume I ran, and I didn't, not really. I walked fast. Faster than a walk probably counts as anything but a controlled kind of fleeing, back up through 4 decks of a ship that had spent 6 hours proving to me it wasn't as empty as it was supposed to be. I did not look into the dining hall again. I did not look into the theater. I kept my eyes on the corridor directly in front of me, the entire way up. Turning point 16 happened on the gangway itself, 3 steps from solid ground, when every light on every deck of the Meridian Star came on at once. Not flickering, not one at a time. All of them, simultaneously, the way a ship lights up when she's alive and loading passengers for a voyage. Every porthole on that 1,000-foot hull, glowing out into the dark dry dock, like she'd just remembered what she used to be. I stood on the gangway and watched it happen, and I have never, before or since, felt smaller than I did in that moment. And then, turning point 17, the last one, the one I still can't make sense of no matter how many times I've turned it over. As suddenly as the lights had come on, they went out, deck by deck this time, top to bottom, in an orderly sequence, exactly the way a ship's systems shut down when someone competent is doing the shutting down. Methodical, deliberate, correct. Like whoever, or whatever, had been keeping her company that night had finished their own walkthrough, right alongside mine, and had just now gotten to the end of it. I signed the checklist sitting in my car in the parking lot, engine running, heater on, hands still not quite steady. Every line matched the required shutdown state. I wasn't lying. Every system that was supposed to be dead was dead, at least by the time I signed it. I never wrote down what I'd seen. I told my supervisor enough that he never asked me to take another decommissioning job again, and he never offered, and neither one of us has ever said the word out loud that would explain why. The Meridian Star went to the breakers 11 days later. I didn't watch it happen, and I didn't ask anyone who did. I work on active vessels now, ships with full crews and running engines and noise from every direction. And some nights, on the ones running quiet in calm water, I still find myself standing in a corridor, listening for something under the hum, and I still don't know what I'm listening for, and some part of me hopes I never find out. Mara Kessler had been second officer on the Solène Star for 11 days when she found the first note. She was 29, sharp with numbers, and this was her first contract at that rank after 4 years of grinding through third officer postings on smaller ships. The promotion had come faster than she expected, and some part of her still felt like she was borrowing someone else's uniform. She kept the deck log meticulously, the way she'd been taught, writing in block letters, timestamps to the minute. So when she opened the log one morning during the 4 to 8 watch and saw a line of handwriting in the margin that wasn't hers, she assumed one of the junior officers had scribbled a joke. The note said, in small, tight cursive, "Check the port ballast valve before 0400. Nobody claimed it. The bosun laughed it off, said maybe the chief mate had a few drinks and wrote it half asleep. Mara almost let it go. But something about the handwriting bothered her. The way the letters leaned hard to the left, consistent, almost printed rather than written. She walked down to the ballast system anyway, more out of habit than belief, and found the port valve actuator seized, packing gland leaking, days from failing outright in open water. She fixed it before it became a problem. She told herself it was luck, a coincidence, the kind of thing you notice once and then forget. 9 days later, a second note appeared, this time in the engine room log, which she rarely even touched. Pump room, starboard side, vapor buildup. Don't let anyone smoke near frame 40. She went down with the chief engineer, half embarrassed to even be asking, and they found a cracked seal on a fuel transfer line, vapor pooling in a space with poor ventilation, exactly where the note said. If someone had lit a cigarette near frame 40 that week, and men still did that on tankers no matter how many rules you posted, the outcome wouldn't have been a fire. It would have been a hole in the side of the ship. That was the moment the crew stopped laughing. That was the moment they started watching her instead of the log. She began sleeping badly, replaying the 2 notes in her head, trying to find the trick. She checked the ship's CCTV footage from the nights both notes appeared. The chart room, where the deck log lived, showed nobody entering after she locked up at the end of her watch. Not the captain, not the bosun, not the cleaning rating who had access to nearly every space on the vessel. Just an empty room with a logbook sitting closed on the desk. And then, hours later, it wasn't closed anymore, and there was writing in it that hadn't been there before. She went to the captain, a heavy-set Filipino man named Antonio Reyes, who had run this route for almost a decade, and she watched something shift in his face the moment she mentioned handwriting in the margins. He didn't laugh at her the way she expected. He got quiet, told her to keep a copy of anything else that showed up, and changed the subject fast enough that she knew he was hiding something rather than dismissing her. It took her 3 more days of pushing before he told her, reluctantly, over coffee in his cabin with the door shut. There had been a second officer on this ship once, years before Mara's time, a man named David Ansah, who died in an accident during a cargo transfer. Reyes wouldn't go into detail beyond that, just said it had been messy, that the company handled it quietly, and that Ansah's name, for reasons nobody in the office could properly explain, had never been fully removed from the ship's official crew articles. A records error. A line item that should have been closed out and simply wasn't, sitting dormant in a database for years, technically still listing him as active crew. Mara couldn't let that sit. She requested the ship's archived logbooks from the company's shore office, going back to the year of Ansah's death, using her rank to justify it as routine research into vessel history. It took a week for the files to arrive as scanned documents. When she opened them and compared the handwriting to the notes she'd photographed in the current log, her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the ship's motion. The slant was identical, the way he crossed his sevens, the tight loop on the lowercase g. It wasn't similar. It was the same hand, down to the pressure of the pen. She learned more about how he'd died from an old friend of Reyes, who'd sailed with Ansah, reached by satellite phone one evening, while Mara sat in on the call at the captain's invitation. Ansah had been meticulous, almost obsessive about small mechanical faults, always flagging things before they became emergencies. The night he died, he'd gone down alone to check a valve during a cargo transfer that the rest of the crew considered routine, against advice to wait for backup, and something had gone wrong fast. A valve failure and a gas pocket that took him before anyone even knew he was in trouble. The official report called it operator error. The friend on the phone didn't sound like he believed that. The crew split down the middle after that. Some of the older ratings started avoiding the chart room at night, leaving the door open a crack instead of shutting it fully, the kind of small superstitious habit sailors pick up and never admit to. Others thought Mara had cracked under the pressure of her first command track posting, that she was writing the notes herself in some kind of stress-induced fog and not remembering it, and she caught 2 of the deck cadets exchanging a look every time she walked past that told her exactly what they'd been saying about her in the mess. Then came the night a note appeared warning about a mooring line under tension near the number 3 winch, and a rating named Ochoa, walking that exact stretch of deck 20 minutes later to check a fender, would have been standing directly in the line's path when it parted if he hadn't been called away by radio for an unrelated reason 30 seconds earlier. Mara watched the line snap from the bridge wing, watched it whip across the space where a man would have been standing, and felt something cold settle into her chest that didn't leave for days. It wasn't luck anymore. It wasn't even prediction anymore. It felt like intervention. She decided to test it properly instead of just reacting to it. She marked specific blank pages in the log with a faint pencil dot, only she would recognize. Set up her own phone on a tripod angled at the chart room desk overnight, hidden inside a life jacket locker with a sliver of a gap for the lens, and told no one, not even the captain. In the morning, a new note had appeared on one of her marked pages. Her phone had recorded 9 hours of an empty, undisturbed room. No door opening, no shadow crossing the frame. The book simply had new words in it that hadn't been there when she checked at midnight, and had been there by 6. That ruled out the explanation she'd wanted most, the mundane one. Some crew member playing an elaborate and cruel prank. She started to wonder about herself instead. Asked the company physician during a routine telemedicine check whether extreme fatigue could produce something like sleepwalking, automatic writing, some dissociative episode she wouldn't remember. The doctor didn't dismiss it outright, ran her through a screening, found nothing, and told her plainly that whatever this was, it wasn't coming from her. She went back to the shore office's HR liaison and pushed harder on the manifest error, because it was the one thread in this whole situation that was still made of paperwork, rather than something she couldn't name. The liaison, after digging through 2 old databases that didn't talk to each other properly, admitted that Ansah's employee record had been migrated during a system upgrade years back and never flagged as deceased, so it kept auto-renewing his certification status and kept his name technically attached to vessel assignments whenever the Solène Star's crew list was regenerated. It was a bug, plain and stupid, and almost insulting in how small it was next to everything it seemed to be causing. But it meant that administratively, on paper, in the system the company itself relied on, David Ansah had never actually left this ship. Wanting some kind of human closure rather than a database explanation, Mara found his widow through the old friend who'd first told her the story, and wrote her a careful, honest email. The reply that came back took 4 days, and told her something that made the whole shape of this reorganize itself in her mind. Ansah had done the exact same thing when he was alive. He used to leave notes in the margins of the log for the officers who came after him. Small warnings about temperamental equipment, habits he'd noticed, faults he suspected before they'd fully declared themselves. His widow said it was practically a signature of his, that he used to say the ship remembers what it wants to forget, and somebody has to write it down before it happens twice. Mara requested his personal effects from the company archive next, half expecting to be told they'd long since been disposed of. But a single sealed box turned up in a warehouse inventory, unopened since the year he died. Inside it was a private notebook, separate from any official log, filled with his own handwriting tracking small anomalies on this exact vessel, valve wear patterns, corrosion rates, a pump that ran hot under certain loads. Near the final entries, dated only days before his death, he'd written a line that made her put the notebook down and not pick it up again for an hour. Something about the transfer valve on the port manifold not sealing right under pressure, and a note to raise it formally before the next cargo operation. Unsigned, unfiled, unheeded. 3 weeks later, moving through a stretch of open water with a storm system building faster than the forecast had predicted, a note appeared warning her, in language more urgent than anything before it, to evacuate the engine room immediately and shut down the port cargo pump before end of watch. There was no visible reason for it. Every gauge read normal. Mara stood in the captain's cabin at 2 in the morning, making the case anyway, telling him everything she'd learned, telling him this pattern had a perfect record, and she wasn't willing to be the one who broke it by staying quiet, even though she knew that if she was wrong, she'd look like exactly what half the crew already whispered she was. Reyes gave the order. The engine room crew came up 11 minutes before the port cargo pump's bearings seized catastrophically under a stress fracture nobody had caught in the last 3 inspections. A fracture that, according to the engineers who tore the pump down afterward, had been building for weeks and would have thrown shrapnel through the space with enough force to kill anyone standing near it. The official investigation that followed, required for any incident that's serious, combed through months of maintenance records, and eventually landed on the same root cause Ansah had flagged in his private notebook years earlier, and never gotten the chance to file. After the ship reached port and the investigation closed, the company finally corrected the records error, properly this time, removing David Ansah's name from the active manifest system for good, more than a decade after he died on that same deck. Mara asked, almost superstitiously herself now, whether anyone from the office wanted to keep his old logbooks, and nobody did, so she kept copies for herself. The notes stopped after that. No more handwriting in the margins, no more warnings before dawn, nothing on any of the pages she still, out of habit, checked twice a shift. Part of her was relieved. Most of her wasn't. She still keeps the deck log the way she was taught. Block letters, timestamps to the minute, and some nights, alone on watch with the chart room quiet and the ship rolling gently under her, she finds herself hoping, more than she'd ever admit to anyone in the mess, that somewhere in whatever was left of him, David Ansah knows he kept someone alive who never even got the chance to thank him properly. My name doesn't matter much for this. What matters is the ship and the 6 hours, and the fact that I was the one who found it first, sitting alone in the data room at 2 in the morning, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside my keyboard. I was the systems technician on the Meridian Deep, a research vessel out on a 40-day survey mission, mapping a stretch of seafloor about 300 miles off the coast, deep enough that the sonar took almost an hour to bounce back a clean image. My job was boring by design. I watched the logs. I made sure the AIS transponder kept broadcasting our position, made sure the GPS feeds synced with the ship's internal clock, made sure nothing drifted out of spec. It was the kind of job where nothing happening is the whole point. So when I pulled the daily position log to archive it and saw 2 tracks instead of 1, my first thought wasn't fear. It was annoyance. I figured a satellite handoff had glitched, duplicated a data packet, something a restart would fix. The 2 tracks ran parallel for 6 hours, from just after midnight to just after 6 in the morning, and then they merged back into a single clean line like nothing had happened. Same ship, same call sign, same everything, except one line showed us holding position over the survey site, and the other showed us 11 nautical miles east, drifting slow, engines apparently idle. I checked the transponder hardware. Only 1 unit on board. No way to broadcast 2 signals from 2 locations with 1 antenna. That was the moment the annoyance turned into something colder. The kind of cold that sits behind your sternum and doesn't move. I didn't tell anyone right away. I told myself I needed more data first, which was true, but it was also an excuse, because some part of me already understood that once I said it out loud, it would become real, in a way it wasn't yet. The first person I did tell was Renata, our navigator, because she'd have logged our actual position independently, by hand, the old-fashioned way, as backup in case the electronics failed. She pulled her paper log without hesitation, confident it would settle the whole thing. Instead, her face went still, in a way I'd never seen on her. Her handwritten entries for that 6-hour window were in her handwriting, unmistakably hers. And they described us at the eastern position, the drifting one, not the survey site. She had no memory of writing it. She remembered being at the site the whole night, running instrument checks, same as always. But the ink on the page said otherwise, and the ink didn't lie the way memory could. That was the second turning point, and it's the one that really opened the door, because once Renata admitted her memory didn't match her own handwriting, it gave the rest of the crew permission to say something was wrong with theirs, too. Our chief scientist, a quiet man named Okonkwo who didn't waste words, remembered the 6 hours as calm, uneventful, the sonar running its slow sweep exactly as scheduled. But when we pulled the actual sonar logs, they showed the equipment powered down for the entire window. Not malfunctioning, deliberately powered down, with a manual shutdown command in the system log, time-stamped. Authenticated under his own crew credentials. He swore he never touched it. He looked at that timestamp like it was a stranger wearing his face. By the 3rd day of quietly comparing notes, we had 5 different crew members, describing 5 different versions of the same night. The cook remembered rough seas, and secured the galley for a swell that, according to the weather buoy data, never happened. The second engineer remembered a fire alarm in the engine room, remembered the smell of it, remembered running with an extinguisher, but there was no alarm logged anywhere, no scorch mark, no evidence at all except his own shaking hands when he told me about it. We started calling it the gap, because none of us wanted to call it anything more specific than that. Nobody wanted to be the first to say what we were all thinking, which was that maybe 6 hours had happened twice, in 2 different ways, to 2 different versions of us, and only one of those versions had made it back into the same body. I want to be honest about what happened next, because this is the part where I stopped being a neutral observer and became someone with something to hide, even if I didn't understand yet what I was hiding. I found a third data trail. Not the AIS, not the sonar logs, but the internal server's own diagnostic record. The kind of log nobody ever reads because it just tracks whether the machine is alive. And buried in it was a full system reboot at 12 minutes past midnight. The exact start of the gap. A reboot nobody had initiated, restoring the system from a backup image that was 4 days old. Which meant that for 6 hours, we had potentially been running on old data laid over a live ship. 2 versions of the same reality stitched together at the seams, and none of us any the wiser which seam we were standing on. I brought this to the captain, a steady, unshakable woman named Idris, who had spent 20 years at sea without, as far as I knew, ever raising her voice. She listened to everything. Then she told me she'd already opened a private inquiry 3 days earlier because she'd noticed the fuel consumption logs showed us burning diesel as if we'd been running the engines the whole night, despite every crew account saying we were holding position, dead in the water, running on minimal power. That was the moment the story stopped being about broken instruments and became about intention. Someone, or something, had used fuel we couldn't account for, moved the ship a distance we couldn't explain, shut down equipment none of us remembered shutting down, and rewritten a night into every one of our heads, differently enough that we couldn't even agree with ourselves. Idris did what any responsible captain would do. She radioed it in. And that's where the next shift happened. Quiet, but seismic. The shore office didn't sound surprised. They sounded prepared. They asked very specific questions. About the fuel log, about the reboot timestamp, about whether we still had the original satellite handshake data before automated systems purged it. Questions that suggested somebody on land already knew this kind of gap was possible, had maybe seen it before, and was now trying to figure out how much of it we'd caught. 2 days later, a support vessel arrived, faster than any of us expected given our distance from shore, carrying 2 technicians we'd never met and equipment we didn't recognize. They didn't introduce themselves with any real detail, just said they were there to assist with a data integrity issue. Language so flat and rehearsed, it felt like a script somebody had used before, on some other ship, for some other gap. They spent 18 hours going through our systems. When they left, half our server logs were gone, not corrupted, removed, cleanly, the way a professional removes something, rather than the way a system fails. My own personal notes, the ones I'd been keeping on a separate drive specifically because I didn't trust the ship's servers anymore, survived only because I'd physically disconnected that drive and kept it in my cabin, taped under the bunk frame like something out of a bad spy film. Except it didn't feel dramatic when I did it. It felt necessary. The official incident report came through 3 weeks later, after we'd finished the survey, and limped back to port. It was 4 pages, and 2 of those pages were redacted so heavily that entire paragraphs were just black rectangles stacked on top of each other. The conclusion, the only clean sentence left, stated that the anomaly was attributed to a transient satellite relay error compounded by a server synchronization fault, resulting in temporary data duplication. No mention of the fuel discrepancy, no mention of the memory discrepancies, no mention of 6 different crew members describing 6 different nights. I asked Renata, before we parted ways at the dock, whether she believed that explanation. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that carries more honesty than words usually do, and said she believed it the way you believe a story you've decided you have to believe, because the alternative doesn't let you sleep. I was reassigned after that voyage. Not fired, not punished. Just quietly moved to a different vessel, doing shallow coastal work, close to shore, close to cell towers, close to the kind of oversight that makes gaps like that one a lot harder to hide. Nobody explained the reassignment. Nobody had to. I understood it as what it was, a way of separating the people who'd been in the room together, spreading us out so the story couldn't keep talking to itself. I still keep the private log. It's not much, just a notebook now, since I don't trust drives the way I used to. I write down what I remember of that night, in my own hand, dated, signed, kept somewhere only I know about. I do it because Renata's handwriting told her something her memory didn't, and I never want to be in that position. Trusting a version of events I can't verify came from me. I don't know what happened during those 6 hours. I don't know if there were 2 ships, or 2 crews, or 2 versions of that night running side by side in some way. Physics has no good language for yet. I don't know if it was a machine failing in the strangest way I've ever heard of, or something closer to what the graveyard shift conversations on that support vessel implied, without ever quite saying, a phenomenon somebody already had a file on, already had a redaction protocol prepared for, already knew not to explain. What I do know is this. Somewhere on a server I no longer have access to, there's a version of that night that doesn't match the one in my head. And somewhere in a drawer in my apartment, there's a notebook that says what I remember, plainly, without anyone else's fingerprints on it. I keep adding to it, a line here and there, whenever some new detail surfaces in a dream or a stray thought I can't place. Not because I think anyone will ever read it, but because if the gap ever opens again, on some other ship, for some other technician sitting alone at 2 in the morning staring at 2 tracks where there should only be one, I want there to be a record that says somebody else saw it too, and didn't let them tell her it never happened. My name is Elena Vasquez, and for 6 years I worked as a safety officer aboard the Meridian Star, a cruise liner that ran the Caribbean circuit out of Miami. I want to tell you about the worst Tuesday of my career, because I think about it more than I think about almost anything else in my life, and I need to say it out loud to someone besides my husband, who has heard this story so many times he can recite it back to me now. It started as a normal drill day. We had a storm warning out of the southeast. Nothing severe yet. Just enough chop that the cruise director had pushed the passenger safety briefing up a few hours so we could get it done before the swells got bad. Man overboard drills are routine. We run them every week, sometimes twice if we're breaking in new crew. We use a training dummy, a weighted mannequin we call Oscar. Orange suit, sandbag body, about 160 pounds, stored in a locker on deck 7, near the aft muster station. Oscar gets tossed. Oscar gets tracked by the bridge. Oscar gets recovered by the rescue boat crew. It's choreography we could do half asleep. That morning when my second officer went to retrieve Oscar for the 9 o'clock drill, the locker was empty. At first nobody panicked. Lockers get misused. Sometimes deck crew stash equipment where it doesn't belong. Sometimes a returning maintenance team leaves gear out of place after a night shift. I told my second officer to check the equipment room 1 deck down, figuring somebody had borrowed Oscar as a prop, maybe for a safety photo, maybe as a joke. Crew do that sometimes, dress the dummy up for a birthday. But the equipment room was empty too. And that's when the first real turn happened, the kind that makes your stomach drop half an inch before your brain even catches up. The locker hadn't just been left open. The lock itself, a coded push-button mechanism that only senior deck staff have the combination to, had been reset. Someone had gone in, taken Oscar, and changed the code on the way out. I want you to understand what that meant. Not someone found an unlocked door. Someone with legitimate access. Someone who knew our systems. Had deliberately taken a 160-pound dummy off a moving ship deck, without a single person noticing, on a day when half the crew was already stationed for the drill. We searched for 2 hours, storm building the whole time, wind picking up, passengers starting to ask questions we didn't have good answers for, and then a steward called it in from deck 4, from inside one of the crew-only stairwells that passengers never see, the ones that run behind the galley walls. Oscar was there, sitting upright, propped against the stairwell wall like he was waiting for a bus. That should have been the end of it. A strange story. A joke gone too far. Case closed. But when my team went to retrieve him, the second turn hit, and this one I still see when I close my eyes. Oscar's suit had been cut open at the torso and retaped shut. Someone had gone into the sandbag body and repacked it, and when we opened him up on the deck to see what had been done, the weight distribution had been changed entirely, concentrated low and to one side, in a pattern that matched, almost exactly, how a human body settles after a specific kind of blunt trauma to the ribs. Not random damage. A rehearsed injury. Someone had used our drill dummy to model what a person would look like. would weigh like, would move like, after being hurt in a very particular way. I've been trained for a lot of things. I have not been trained for the moment you realize a piece of safety equipment has become evidence. We locked down the ship's data logs first, because that felt like the sane, procedural thing to do. And that's where the third turn came in. The keycard access log for the locker showed no entry at all during the window Oscar went missing. Not a wrong code, not a failed attempt, nothing, which meant the person hadn't used a card. They'd used the manual override, a physical key that only exists in triplicate. One held by the captain, one by the chief engineer, and one by me. All three keys were accounted for. Mine was on my belt. The captain's was in his cabin safe. The chief engineer's, when we checked, was also exactly where it should have been. So how? That question sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of the day, and it only got heavier with the fourth turn, when our IT officer, going through the maintenance logs almost as an afterthought, found that the locker's electronic backup system had been serviced 2 weeks earlier, off-cycle, outside the normal maintenance schedule, by a technician who didn't show up in the standard rotation roster. A one-time work order, signed off, but by a supervisor who, when I called him on the sat phone that afternoon, told me he had never approved any such order. Someone had planned this. Not that morning. Weeks out. We pulled crew manifests, cross-referenced who had been on shift near that locker in the 2 weeks prior, who had Deck 7 clearance, who had any history with mechanical systems that would let them override a lock without leaving a card trace. That's a lot of people on a ship this size, almost 90, with legitimate reasons to be in that corridor. But the fifth turn narrowed it fast, in a way that made my hands go cold. The maintenance work order, the fake one, had been filed using a supervisor login that had been deactivated 4 months earlier, when that supervisor left the company. Deactivated logins don't work. Except this one had, for exactly 11 minutes, on exactly 1 day, which told us someone still had a way into a system that was supposed to be dead. I brought this to the captain. He wanted to keep it contained. No ship-wide announcement. No panic during a storm warning with 2,000 passengers aboard, and nowhere for anyone to go. I agreed, reluctantly. And that containment is the reason what happened next stayed between about 6 of us for the rest of the voyage. The sixth turn came from something almost embarrassingly simple. I went back to the stairwell where Oscar had been found, because something about the placement had been bothering me since morning, and I hadn't let myself sit with it. He hadn't just been left there. He'd been positioned facing a specific door, a maintenance access door, that led down into one of the crew cabin corridors on Deck 3. The corridors senior staff use, mine included. Oscar wasn't hidden. He was staged, like a rehearsal marker, facing the exact route someone would take to reach senior officer quarters unseen. That's the moment the day stopped being strange and started being frightening. The seventh turn was small on its own, but it clicked everything into place. I remembered, almost by accident, that 3 weeks earlier I'd written up a junior deckhand, a 26-year-old named Marcus Yude, for an altercation with a passenger during a lifeboat briefing. Nothing dramatic at the time, a shouting match. The passenger had grabbed his arm and he'd shoved back a little too hard, and I'd filed the report the way I was supposed to, recommending a formal warning. Marcus had been furious about it. He told me, in front of 2 witnesses, that I'd ruined his contract for nothing. I hadn't thought about it since. Write-ups happen constantly on a ship this size. I pulled his file that afternoon, and the 8th turn landed like a physical blow. Marcus Yude had Deck 7 access. Marcus Yude had worked 2 summers, before joining us, as an electronics technician for a smaller line, which meant he had exactly the kind of systems knowledge that could explain a login ghosting back to life for 11 minutes. And Marcus Yude's cabin was on Deck 3, in the corridor Oscar had been staged to face. I didn't confront him. I want to be very clear about that, because everything in me wanted to, and everything I'd been trained to do told me not to. Confronting someone you suspect of rehearsing violence, alone, on a ship in open water during a storm, is how safety officers become the next incident. So instead, the 9th turn, I did something almost cowardly, and I'm not ashamed of it anymore. I asked the cruise director to reassign Marcus, quietly, to a guest-facing role on the opposite side of the ship for the remainder of the voyage, framed as a staffing need, nothing alarming, while I pulled every piece of footage I could from the corridors near Deck 7 and Deck 3, going back a month. The footage is where the 10th turn hit, and it's the part I still lose sleep over. There was a full 11-day gap in the Deck 7 camera archive. Not corrupted, not glitched. Deleted. Cleanly. Using an admin credential. The same dead login. Whatever Marcus had rehearsed, or was rehearsing, he'd been careful enough to erase the record of himself learning how. By the time we docked back in Miami 4 days later, I had enough, barely, to bring ship security and the company's shoreside investigations team in, without it being just my word against a young man's clean employment record. And this is where the 11th turn came, the one that still makes my throat tight. When they searched his cabin under a company policy clause, not the police, we didn't have grounds for police yet, they found a notebook, handwritten, diagrams of corridor routes, times of shift changes for senior staff, my name among them, timestamps going back nearly 2 months. Not a manifesto, nothing that screamed intent in a way a court would love, just patient, quiet, obsessive documentation of how a person could move through this ship unseen, and when the people who might stop him would be somewhere else. He was removed from the vessel in Miami under a workplace conduct violation, not a criminal charge, because in the end, there was no assault, no attack, nothing that had actually happened yet. Only the terrifying architecture of something that had been building toward happening. The 12th turn is the one I carry hardest, because it isn't a twist in the story, it's a twist in how I see my own life now. Weeks later, going through the incident file one final time before it closed, I found the date on that off-cycle maintenance work order. It was filed 2 days after I wrote him up, which meant the whole thing, the locker, the login, the notebook, hadn't been random or slow-building rage. It had been a direct response to me, to a report I filled out on a Tuesday afternoon, without thinking twice, because that's the job. I still do this work. I want to say that clearly, because people expect this story to end with me quitting, and it didn't. But I check that stairwell every single shift now, even on ships where I know for a fact there's no one like Marcus aboard. I look at every dummy in every locker a half-second longer than I need to, not because I think a mannequin is going to hurt me, because I learned, in the worst possible way, that the things that terrify you at sea are almost never the ship or the water or the storm. They're the person standing 3 doors down, quietly deciding what they're capable of, while you're busy doing your job and assuming everyone around you is doing theirs for the same reasons you are. I took the night watch that week because Marisol needed the time off for her daughter's recital, and I figured 8 hours of empty ocean and instrument checks was an easy trade. The Meridian Star was a small ship, part cargo, part passenger charter, the kind that takes retirees and researchers on quiet crossings where nothing ever happens. 22 passengers that trip. One of them was an old man named Everett Voss, 86 years old, traveling with his daughter and son-in-law, the kind of frail that made the crew speak a little softer around him, without anyone saying why. Word below decks was that he had a heart condition, and the family knew this might be his last trip, that he'd asked to die at sea if it came to that, somewhere out past the sight of land, the way his own father had. So when Captain Reyes pulled me aside near midnight, 3 days into the crossing, and told me Voss had passed peacefully in his cabin an hour earlier, I wasn't shocked. Just quiet. He said the family wanted it handled tonight, at sea. No fuss. No radio calls to the mainland stirring up paperwork and delays, because that was the old man's wish, and they had the documentation to prove it. He needed a second set of hands for the ceremony, someone steady, someone who wouldn't talk. I said yes, because it felt like an honor, not a burden. That was the first mistake I made that night, thinking this was going to be simple. We brought the body up wrapped in white canvas, a little after 1 in the morning, and the family was already on deck waiting, which struck me as strange only for a second, because grief doesn't wait for anyone to call it, does it? The daughter, Renata, stood very still with her husband's arm around her, and she wasn't crying, not one tear the whole time. I told myself people grieve in different ways, that shock does strange things to a face, and I let it go, because that's what you do when you want something to make sense. The captain read from a laminated card, words about return to the deep and mercy of the sea, and I helped tilt the plank, and the weighted canvas slid into black water without a sound loud enough to matter, swallowed clean. It should have felt like closure. Instead, something in my chest just kept tightening, the way it does when you know you're forgetting something important and can't name what. It was afterward, in the wheelhouse, filing away the burial authorization for the log, that I actually read the date on it. The form was signed, notarized even, dated 4 days before we ever left port. 4 days before Everett Voss had died. I checked it twice, because I assumed I was misreading exhaustion into ink. But no, the date was right there, clean and deliberate, alongside a signature that matched the ship's own physician, a man who wasn't even supposed to be aboard for another 2 weeks. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself paperwork gets pre-filled sometimes, that maritime law probably required advance authorization for burial at sea, regardless of when death occurred, that I was reading menace into bureaucracy because it was 2 in the morning and I was tired. But something had shifted in me, quiet and cold, like a door left open somewhere down a hallway I couldn't see. The next evening, I went looking for the ship's physician, a man named Dr. Halloway, who kept mostly to himself in the small infirmary near the stern, and found the room locked, his name already stripped off the manifest board, like he'd never been assigned to the crossing at all. When I asked the purser about him, she looked at me the way you look at someone who's asked a question they shouldn't have, and said there'd been some confusion, that Halloway had disembarked at the last port, before we ever left. Except I remembered seeing him at dinner the first night, remembered him pouring wine for the captain like an old friend. I started paying attention after that, the way you do once your body decides something is wrong, even if your mind hasn't caught up. I noticed Everett Voss's cabin had already been cleaned and remade up by the second morning, no trace of him left, no belongings being catalogued for the family, nothing waiting to be shipped home. I noticed Renata and her husband kept to themselves at meals, speaking in low tones, and once, passing their cabin door, I heard her say the word, "confirmed," in a voice too businesslike for a woman who'd just lost her father. 3 nights after the burial, unable to sleep, I went down to check the cargo manifest for an unrelated reason, a routine inventory, and found a second name flagged for special disposition, discreet, further down the list. A name I didn't recognize, scheduled for the return leg of the voyage, 2 weeks out. Someone who hadn't even boarded yet. That was when the cold in my chest turned into something closer to fear. Because a burial authorization can't be written in advance for a man who hasn't died, unless someone already knows exactly how and when it's going to happen. I went to the captain the next day, tried to frame it as simple curiosity about procedure, asked him how burial authorizations usually worked, whether they were always this fast. He looked at me for a long moment, longer than the question deserved, and said something about maritime insurance requiring pre-cleared paperwork for elderly passengers with terminal conditions. Standard practice, nothing more. His voice was even, rehearsed almost, and it was the rehearsed part that scared me more than anything he actually said. I found Voss's cabin steward 2 days later, a young man named Iggy who'd been quiet the whole trip, and pressed him gently about what he'd seen the night it happened. He told me, almost in a whisper, that he'd brought the old man his evening tea like always, and that Voss had seemed fine. Tired, but fine. Talking about seeing his granddaughter when they docked. Fine. 1 hour before he was declared dead. Iggy said he didn't sleep right anymore, that he kept thinking about the teacup, how it was already washed and put away before anyone had called for the body. That night I couldn't stop thinking about the old man's face in the canvas, how peaceful it had looked, how I'd assumed peaceful meant natural. I started to wonder if what I'd helped commit to the water wasn't a death but an answer to a question someone else had already decided the ending to, days before we set sail, maybe longer. I went looking through old crossing logs in the ship's records room, the kind of digging that feels like trespassing even when it's technically allowed, and found 2 other burial-at-sea authorizations from previous voyages, both elderly passengers, both signed and dated before the recorded dates of death. Both families who'd paid what the ledger vaguely called an expedited passage fee 2 other times. Not one strange exception. A pattern, quiet and repeating. Like something the ship itself had learned to do well. I confronted Renata directly, finally, on the 5th night, cornered her near the stern rail when her husband had gone below. I asked her plainly why the paperwork was signed before her father died. She didn't flinch, didn't perform grief for me the way she had on deck that first night. She just looked out at the water and said that some kinds of mercy have to be arranged in advance, that her father had been suffering for months in ways the family didn't want made public, and that the ship offered something hospitals couldn't, a clean ending on his terms, before the disease could take those terms away from him. She said it like she expected me to understand, like I was already part of it simply by having helped carry him to the rail. I didn't sleep after that conversation. I kept turning over what she'd said, mercy arranged in advance, and I didn't know anymore if I'd taken part in an act of love or something closer to murder wearing love's clothing. And worse, I didn't know which one would let me sleep easier if I decided to believe it. 2 nights before we reached port, I went back to the manifest one final time, telling myself I needed to be sure. That certainty would let me decide what to do once we docked. And there, buried in the crew assignment history, 3 voyages back, was a note I'd missed the first time. A recommendation, handwritten, attaching my own name to this crossing specifically, requested by the captain by name, for reasons the note didn't specify beyond 4 words. Reliable, discreet, won't ask. I stood there a long time with that page in my hands, feeling something colder than fear settle into me, because it meant I hadn't stumbled into this by taking Marisol's shift out of convenience. Someone had chosen me for this crossing weeks before I ever agreed to trade with her, had decided, in advance, the same way they'd decided everything else, that I was the kind of man who'd help and then stay quiet about it. We reached port 2 days later under a gray morning sky, and I stood at the rail, watching the harbor come into focus, and I still hadn't said a word to anyone on land. Not the Coast Guard, not a reporter, not even Marisol, when she asked how the crossing went. I told her it was quiet, uneventful. She said that's good, and went back to talking about her daughter's recital, and I let her, because I still don't know what I witnessed out there. Whether it was a mercy the world isn't ready to permit, or a system that had learned to dress its cruelty in white canvas and gentle words, or something in between that doesn't have a clean name yet. All I know is that somewhere out past the edge of where anyone could see, an old man went into the water on a date someone else had already chosen for him, and I helped lower him in, and I have not told a single soul. And some nights, when the water outside my window gets very still, I wonder if my silence was its own kind of signature, on a form I never got to read.